And now Dr. Woodward will give a science talk. He's a professor at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and also teaching at Peak. Dr. Woodward began his academic career and as an undergraduate student at the University of Oxford, where he stayed to study for his doctorate at the Physical Theoretical Chemistry Laboratory. Today, he will deliver his talk from his laboratory. Hi.
Hi there. Thank you, Dr. Boykman. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my laboratory. So as you heard, my name is Johnny Woodward, and I teach chemistry and other sciences courses as part of ES, the Environmental Sciences Program. So today, I'm going to try and tell you a story about animals and magnetism, and I hope you'll find this really fascinating. Now, I expect that you're probably going to have some questions during the presentation while I'm speaking. So if you want to ask something, write it in the Zoom Q&A box. Okay, so this is Juta. Okay, he's a graduate student working in my research group and here in this laboratory. And he's going to go online in Zoom while I'm presenting and try to answer as many questions as possible. Okay, and he's also going to pick out his favorite question from the ones he reads, and I'll answer that question live at the end of the talk. Okay, all right, so let's get started. Okay, so the title of my talk then is Animal Magnetism, where quantum mechanics meets biology. So what am I going to tell you about? Well, I'm going to hopefully show you, sorry, I'm using this the wrong way. What are you going to learn? I'm going to tell you about the magnetic sense of animals. I'll teach you a little bit about that. Then I'm going to move to some really basic ideas of fundamental physics and talk about electrons, spin, radical pairs, and magnetic fields. And then finally, I'm going to show you some very recent work from our lab that fits into the story that I'm going to tell you. Okay, so in recent years, it's been an amazing discovery of scientists that many different kinds of animals have an extra sense that we didn't previously know they had. These animals are capable of sensing the Earth's magnetic field and using that for information. And this ability, this built-in sense, is called magnetoreception. Okay, so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about animals and magnetoreception, and then think about how on earth animals might be able to do this. So first of all, what kind of animals are able to sense magnetic fields? Well, it turns out there's quite a lot. I've got a few examples for you here. The first one are in bacteria, and I'll move on and tell you a little bit about bacteria in a moment. But we also know that nematodes, they're these things here, C. elegans, that you see, tiny little microscopic creatures, they can sense magnetic fields. Arthropods, that includes butterflies, that's a monarch butterfly, and fruit flies. All these kind of creatures are well known to be able to sense the field. Mollusks, even like you can see in the picture here, underwater. Chordates, so particularly this very famous sea turtles are using magnetic fields. I'll explain about them in a moment. Even birds and vertebrates, so mice, mole rats, bats, foxes, and so on. You can see here a robin. Many major animals are capable of sensing the Earth's field. And one question that many scientists are very curious about, and many people have been curious about, is can human beings sense the Earth's field? And that's a story for another day. Okay, so we want to move on and say, how on earth could these animals be able to sense the Earth's magnetic field? It's incredibly weak. If you imagine a magnet that's stuck to a fridge magnet, the Earth's magnetic field is hundreds or almost 1,000 times weaker than those magnets. So how on earth do animals do this? Well, if you think about history and how humans detect the Earth's magnetic field, they use a magnet, they use a compass. All right, so maybe animals have actually got their own little compasses built in. And what you see in the picture here is a material called magnetite. It's an oxide of iron, and it's a magnetic material. Okay, so can animals use built-in magnets to do this? And it turns out that, for example, bacteria can. So I'm going to show you a movie now from the universities that you can see linked at the bottom here, where we see what are called magnetotactic bacteria. Now, these bacteria actually grow inside their bodies their own little tiny magnets. You can see them in this microscope image here, these magnetic nanoparticles. And what that means is, as the bacteria swim, the magnetic field can cause them to move, and they swim in a particular direction. So these universities here did a really great experiment. They got some magnetotactic bacteria in this microfluidic chip, and they built a magnet that they could control with their game controller, and then a very nice microscope. And what they were able to do then was essentially play video games with the bacteria. As they change the controller direction, the bacteria can swim around in different directions. Okay, so that's remarkable. These tiny bacteria grow their own magnets inside, and they can use that to respond to magnetic fields in the environment. But what about more sophisticated animals? I mean, do these birds or do other animals actually have these magnets built in? Well, let's have a look at what some of the biology information tells us, what scientists have discovered. So I'm going to show you 3 animals here. This is the Arctic tern, the rock pigeon, and the loggerhead turtle. And you can see drawn on this globe the journeys that these animals take. The Arctic tern, for example, can fly up to 90,000 kilometers a year when it migrates during the change of seasons. And it uses the Earth's magnetic field to know where to go. And these loggerhead turtles, for example, lay their eggs, swim in a huge trajectory, and come back a year later to exactly the spot where they left their eggs. So they have this remarkable ability to sense the Earth's field. But what do we know? How do they do this? Well, biologists that study animal behavior, so-called behavioral biologists, they've discovered that birds can sense the direction of magnetic fields, but they can't sense the polarity. In other words, they don't know which is the North Pole and which is the South Pole. That's very different than a normal compass. Similarly, and quite remarkably, it turns out that birds' built-in magnetic compasses don't work in the dark. Birds have to have light in order to use them. And that's not just to see where they're going. The compass simply doesn't work in the dark. And even more, we can find out that birds, for example, if they have blue light, they can navigate as normal. Same with green light. But if they're only in red light, their compass stops working. So these are really, really very unusual observations. And we cannot explain these observations if they've just got these tiny built-in magnets. So there must be another explanation. And scientists have thought long about this. And finally, it seems that we have some ideas about what might be going on. And that's what I'm going to tell you. Okay, so birds and other animals, built-in tiny magnets are not responsible in this case. And in fact, the reality turns out to be really quite amazing. And it turns out that what these animals use are in fact built-in really, really unbelievably tiny magnets. In fact, the smallest magnets that you can possibly imagine. So that takes us right back to physics. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about these tiny, tiny, tiny magnets. So I know many of you will be studying chemistry at school and physics, and hopefully you know that atoms are made up with central positive nuclei and electrons moving around those nuclei. And electrons are actually fundamental particles. You can't break electrons down into anything smaller. They're really, really the smallest that we know. Okay, and maybe those of you who've been studying chemistry have seen that in atoms, the electrons are often arranged in these amazing shapes called orbitals. Now, I want to tell you some facts about electrons, and some of them you'll be very aware of. Electrons have a series of built-in properties. Okay, so first of all, electrons, we know, have mass, and we know exactly what the mass of electrons is. It's about 9 × 10 to the power minus 31, so 0.31009 kilograms. So they're incredibly light. And you probably also know that electrons have got charge. Electrons are negatively charged particles, and they have this charge 1.6 times 10 to the power minus 19 coulombs. But electrons have another fundamental built-in property. And some of you may know about it, some of you may not, but it's an unusual property, and it's called spin. And the spin of an electron is about 9 times 10 to the power minus 35 joule seconds. That's an unusual unit as well. And spin is something remarkable. It's a bit like angular momentum. So angular momentum comes from objects that move in circles or in orbits. Okay, so it's a bit like that, but it's also a bit different because it's something that's built into the electron, and it's purely quantum mechanical. There is nothing like spin in the world that we normally see, rather than down at this tiny scale. All right, so I want to tell you a little about electrons and their spin and an amazing story. So the first thing I want to tell you is that electrons are magnetic. Because of this spin, this causes electrons to behave like these tiny magnets, as you see in the picture here. And this is where the story starts to come together. Okay, so all magnets that you're familiar with, like your fridge magnets, they're magnetic because in some way in those materials, the electron magnets, the tiny electron magnets, all line up together and give you a magnetic effect. Okay, but those of you who study things like molecules, if you've been studying chemistry, you'll know that most molecules are really not magnetic. All right, and I want to explain why that's the case. So that in almost all atoms and molecules, the electrons pair up together, and this causes their magnetic fields to cancel. And basically almost all molecules have an even number of electrons, and they're all paired up together. So that means that the molecules themselves, even though they've got magnetic electrons in them, have no magnetism of their own. But I also want to show you that there are some interesting exceptions to that. So let me show you some experiments here. These are from the Jefferson lab in the US. And I want to show you, if you think about the air in the room around you, about 80% of that air is nitrogen, and about 20% of that air is oxygen. And if you take the nitrogen and the oxygen and you cool them down until they're very cold and they turn into a liquid, we can do some interesting experiments with you. And what we find is that in nitrogen, all the electrons are paired up, and so nitrogen is not magnetic. So if we take some liquid nitrogen here and we pour it into a magnet, you'll see that absolutely nothing happens at all. The liquid nitrogen just goes straight through the magnet. But if we cool some oxygen down and take liquid oxygen, you can see, look, it sticks to the magnet. Oxygen is magnetic. It's hard to believe, but if you hold a magnet in the air, some of the oxygen molecules in the air are drawn towards your magnet. So some molecules are, not very many, but some molecules are actually magnetic. Now, to finish this, what's quite a complicated story, I need to talk to you a little bit about chemical bonds. And hopefully you know and have heard at school about covalent bonds. And when we have a covalent bond between two atoms, shown as A and B here, then that bond can actually break in two different ways. If it breaks and both the electrons go to one of the atoms, i.e. unsymmetrically, then we form what are called a pair of ions. But if the bond breaks symmetrically, so that one electron goes to each atom, then we form instead what are known as free radicals, or we'll just call them radicals, a pair of radicals. Okay, and so these radicals are very important species in biology. They're very important species in the atmosphere, and in terms of pollution and things like the ozone layer. These radicals are very important. And what you can see is radicals have not got an even number of electrons. They've got an odd number of electrons, and they have a single unpaired electron. So if we remind ourselves now that those two electrons are behaving as magnets, then when we break apart the bond and make the two radicals, the radicals that we get are magnetic. And it's these magnetic free radicals that start to tell us about the story of animal navigation. Okay, let's turn that idea around. If I break a bond and form two radicals, it's very common in chemistry for two radicals to come together and make a bond. That's a kind of chemical reaction. So if we do this in reverse, if A radical and B radical meet each other, they can form a chemical bond. But we have a very important rule in chemistry. And if we remember these magnets, when an A radical meets a B radical, they can only do this if the two radicals become paired. If an A radical and a B radical happen to meet each other with the same, in the same magnetic state, then no chemical reaction can happen. And this is amazing. In chemistry, this is having two very reactive species next to each other, and they can't react. So this leads us now into the mechanism by which animal navigation may be taking place. So the radical pair reactions, the reactions of these pairs of radicals, depend on the magnetic arrangement of these electrons. So let's imagine the situation where I have two radicals that bump into each other, but they're in the same magnetic state, they can't react. But if something could happen to make one of them flip their spin over, then suddenly a chemical reaction can take place and the system becomes more reactive than it was. And it turns out that a process by which we can flip electron spins is a well-known quantum mechanical process. And what's really important is how well this happens, how easily we can flip these spins depends on magnetic field. So if we put a magnetic field nearby, it changes how easily we can flip these spins, and that changes how easily the chemical reaction can take place. So this remarkable mechanism is called the radical pair mechanism, and in recent years, scientists now started to believe that this might be responsible for the animal magnetic effects. So we've known since the 1970s that radical pairs can change chemical reactions, and they can make chemical reactions go faster or slower. And the question is, can this happen in biology, in real living systems? So if we go back to the birds and remember that they need light, and remember that they can't sense the north-south nature of the field, it turns out that these radical pair reactions are exactly the same. And so scientists believe that in birds, for example, in their eyes, in the retina, in the back of the eye where they see, and in the cells that are known as cone cells that allow us to see, there are special proteins called cryptochromes. And it's believed that when blue light shines on these cryptochromes, they generate radical pairs. And the effects of these radical pairs are transmitted to the brain via the optic nerve. And what that means is that radical pair reactions then in the bird's eyes might allow them to see the magnetic field in their environment. Now, let me finish off by telling you about what we've been doing in our lab. So I've told you kind of two stories. I've told you about behavioral biologists and what animals do, and I've told you about chemists and scientists studying these radical pair reactions. And what we tried to do in our lab was to bring these two worlds together and see if we can actually see radical pairs being formed and reacting and being sensitive to magnetic fields in real living systems, in cells. And so we can start to ask this question: can magnetic fields affect radical pairs in living cells? And so very recently, what we do is we've been designing instruments. So I've talked about chemistry, biology, but we use a lot of engineering in our lab too, to build new instruments like this microscope behind me here, to try and answer this question. Can we look inside cells and see these radical pair processes and watch whether magnets affect them? And we recently had some pretty big breakthroughs in this. And let me show you the information that was published on the university's website in January. And in these experiments, what we did was we took cells and shine light on them. And this light can be used to detect radical pair reactions inside the cells. All right, so we take blue light, we shine it on the cells, and the cells produce a green glow. And then what we did was we took a magnetic field and turned it on and off. And as we turn the magnetic field on and off, we cause the green glow to change. When we turn on the field, the glow of the cells gets dimmer. And when we switch it off again, it gets brighter. And this tells us that there are radical pair reactions happening in the cells and that they are magnetic field sensitive. So for the very first time, we can actually see these radical pairs being made inside cells by the natural molecules in themselves and responding to magnetic fields. Okay, so let me just conclude my talk. First of all, I hope that I've shown you that many animals can sense magnetic fields. I've shown you that electrons can behave as tiny magnets, that most molecules are not magnetic, but these things called radicals are magnetic. And that through special reactions of these pairs of radicals, we can generate chemical reactions that can respond to magnetic fields. And finally, now recently, scientists are starting to really believe that these radical pairs may be responsible for biological magnetoreception. So thank you very much for listening so carefully. We're almost out of time. If you want to know more, do visit my lab's website. You can access the QR code here. Before we finish, I'm going to just show you the microscope for real. So I'm going to move over there now. Okay, we're going to take a quick look. So here's one of the microscopes that we built. But the one in the experiments that I just described to you is here. It was built by the members of my lab. And perhaps I don't have much time, but what you can see here is the sample is hiding under here. We have cameras, blue laser here, and you can see this yellow magnet head here. This can create a magnetic field inside the sample, and it can point it in any direction, spin it around, do all sorts of clever things with it. Now, it looks very small, but actually it's going over to an enormous cooler and this enormous big box power supply over here. So this is a very sophisticated magnet system. And using this instrument that we built, we were able to do those experiments. So I think I'm almost out of time, but hopefully we've still got time to have the one question that you picked out. So let me go back to Dr. Boykman and see if there's a question that's been selected.
Hi.
Dr. Boykman, do we have a question?
Yeah, we have many questions, but please, your students, please select one.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot see the which is selected.
Did you select it? It's the final one, maybe?
What is the significance of Mesmer's experience in the discovery of animal magnetism?
Okay, so this is an interesting question. So maybe some of you have heard of this historical figure, Anton Mesmer. The word mesmerism comes from this, which you think of as hypnotizing and controlling people's mind. But back in history, and I can't remember exactly when Anton Mesmer was alive, but I think in the 17th or 18th century, and Anton Mesmer coined this term animal magnetism. And he actually believed that there was a real force, a magnetic force that human beings generated that could be used to communicate. Now, we don't really necessarily think that's true anymore, but it's a really, really interesting example of how people have been interested in how human beings and magnetic fields interact throughout history. Ever since, the first humans discovered lodestones, these kind of magnetic stones, people have been really, really obsessed with how they might affect human beings and their health, for example. So there's a very famous, a lot of crazy people in the past using crazy ideas of magnets to try and, make people better when they're sick. But now I think for the first time probably in history, we're really starting to understand the fundamental basic mechanism of how magnetic fields can interact with biology. So thank you for a great question. I'm sorry I can't answer any more, but Zhu and I, after I finish speaking, will keep answering the questions online and we'll answer as many as we can. So thank you again so much for your attention. I hope you found this interesting, and back to Dr. Boykman in the main theater. See you later.
See you later. Thank you very much, Professor Woodward.